Imagine a world where, at the click of a button, government forms can be pre completed, or where you can access the entirety of your health record and that can be ported over, or a world where, upon the birth of your second baby, you get an automatic tax credit applied without having to do anything at all. These are examples of what is possible now with the once only policy. So, thank you for joining me today for this session. Um, just to give you a little lay of the land, we're going to start off by discussing the what's of this policy, and giving you a sense of what my specific interest in this was and what angle we approached this work from was for. After that, we will be discussing some of the nuances of the policy as we've seen it applied in different countries. And then finally, we will be giving you a sense of the architectural design that we envision for this policy and running you through that. As Amanda mentioned, I have worked with a variety of organizations. For this specific work, I was acting as a fellow for the Harvard Kennedy School between the years 2019 and 2020. And this is what we learned. So, what is once only? Under the once only policy, users such as citizens, residents, and businesses can need only provide diverse data once when in contact with government. Beyond that initial data transfer, assuming that consent has been taken by the government, departments across all tiers, national, provincial, and local, can then internally share and reuse this information to create public value and better serve the resident. With once only, there are two key underlying elements that have to be in place. And we've seen this across the many examples that we looked at. So one is some sort of identification mechanism that allows a user to be uniquely identified within a system and for their information across different layers to be stitched together. And then two is a data sharing mechanism, which is essentially there to help different tiers of government move the data between one tier and another. So why are we interested in once only? Well, at the face of it, it is usually seen as a way of administratively disburdening both users and governments. So what do we mean by that? We mean very basic benefits that accrue. So an individual benefits because they don't have to spend repeated amounts of times, giving the same information to the government. It is made easier for them. They benefit from a user experience standpoint, but they also benefit because they have to spend less time and less resources when interacting with government. And then there are also benefits to government, which usually go around, there are optimized internal processes that come about as a result of having to store data. It increases the efficiency of the government, and it also can help with second tier concerns such as fraud prevention, etc. But more than this, more than these administrative benefits, which the EU estimates to stand at about $5 billion a year, we believe that OOP has the potential to fundamentally transform government operations. So this is because once only implementation necessitates the development and use of specific underlying elements, the identity and data sharing mechanisms I pointed out earlier, across multiple layers. And subsequently, these elements can be leveraged for any number of additional purposes. So it's not just about user centricity, it's really about creating a gateway to government as a platform. And how do we believe this can come about? Well, we believe it can come about because of four different things. First, we believe that as a result of implementing once only, you'll have better service delivery, both in terms of method, meaning how services are offered, and also form, meaning what kind of services are offered. Two, we believe that data will be leveraged, will be available more readily under OOP, and then can be responsibly leveraged to create additional benefits for citizens. Number three, we believe that with a strong once only system in place, it creates the technical basis for advanced interoperability, particularly for data in government. And then number four, we believe that with once only policy in place, it orients governments to become more digital. It makes them more agile, and it makes them more user-centric. all of which are things that we look for in a government as a platform solution. But with all of these great benefits that come with things like once only, we believe that there are also some dangers. So even as the policy itself and its underlying elements create new opportunities to transform how government operates, it also creates additional risks related to government use of people's personal data, making data easily accessible, and keeping institutions accountable. Giving governments the ability to stitch together sensitive information about an individual and then conclusively link it to a single profile makes that individual permanently visible to and trackable by the government. And at an aggregate level in particular, this can be quite concerning. In the absence of meaningful controls, there is a danger that something like OOP could create structures that are ripe for exploitation and abuse to the detriment of our freedoms and democracies. And this is not just concerning for countries which may have a poor accountability track record, it is also concerning for relatively responsible regimes. This is not to say that the once only policy is inherently bad, but it does mean that we need to build in good protections. Because from a privacy perspective, this has huge potential ramifications for public trust and safety. And of course, is also significantly exacerbated by technologies that are fundamentally rooted in people's personal data. Um, there is obviously a security element to concerns about the policy as well. But for us, we really have chosen to focus on the privacy element because we believe that understanding how to ethically use personal data to advance service delivery while creating sufficient protections for individuals is a core challenge for all governments in the 21st century. So, the goal of our work, as you can imagine, is to explore how we can harness the benefits of once only while minimizing the risks to create a world where the power of the state is counterbalanced by the power of both the citizenry and of the system itself. Keeping that in mind, we kind of architecturally designed what we think of as what I call an OOP stack, I guess. So it starts with the privacy framework. It then layers on an identification mechanism, which sits below a data sharing mechanism, and then the policy itself. And this in collection is what we refer to as the OOP stack. And we're going to explore this a bit more in a bit more detail in a little bit. So just briefly touching on the methodology, there was a great deal of desktop research based on the 2 decades of experience that various European countries have with this. And then we had several conversations with experts in the field across the world. And then finally, we designed 5 mini case studies that were centered around the countries of Estonia, the Netherlands, the UK, Canada, and Australia. And when you look across these countries, what you see is varying levels of maturity. So we have Netherlands and Estonia sitting at a very, very high level of maturity in this space. And then we have countries like Australia and Canada, which are still very nascent in exploring this, at least at the time that was the case. The approaches in general that we have looked at in detail have been a principal approach, and I'm going to touch on this in greater detail in a second. But the thing to note over here is that the UK in particular has followed a slightly different approach to the rest of the countries. And then how each country has implemented this policy differs, as can be seen by the different components that underlie OOP in their particular context. So that ends kind of part 1 of this. We're now going to move on to part 2, which is just better understanding some of the nuances of once only. So there are 2 things over here to note. One is, what definition of OOP do countries choose to implement? So there is one definition in which information is just collected once, and there is another definition in which information both has to be collected and stored once. In the collect once kind of model, over there, you really are looking at information that is replicated probably across multiple silos. But in the collect and store once, the idea is that it really is going to be stored in one designated area. Which one you go for is important, but I think more important is that what a country chooses to do is materially impacts the design choices that they end up making. In addition to the definition, the other important thing to note is the approach, which I also briefly highlighted in the previous slide. So across the kind of research that we did, we came up with these 2 designations. One is what I call a principal approach, and the other is something that I call a program approach. So, a principle approach is one which treats once only as a foundational principle that has to be implemented across all of government. And this is something that we've seen in Estonia and the Netherlands. And in the principal approach, it's very large scale. Tends to be a longer term play, and it really is about investing in transforming legacy systems so that they operate in new ways. As a result, this is also an approach that requires longer term political buy in. And so, as I mentioned, we see it in Estonia. And the way they kind of layered this on is that in 2000, they came up with the idea of a once only, which is also known as the tell us once policy in some places, and kind of instituted that. And then in 2007, made the decision that information not only had to be collected once, but it also had to be stored once. So it was a tiered approach, but that's where they ended up. And so the definition and approach kind of also work in tandem. And then the other approach that we see is a programmatic approach, where it really is treated as something that is limited to a very specific and tightly defined use case. And so in this program approach, what you see is, it's more about opportunistic implementation. It's about leveraging the kind of infrastructure what already exists, and is probably like a shorter term play, and it just requires kind of more immediate stakeholder buy-in for it to work. Before we kind of talk about this further, I just want to give you one example of a programmatic approach, which is the UK's approach to birth and death notification. So in 2007, the UK's Department of Work and Pensions created their Tell Us Once policy. And essentially, the idea was to decrease the burden on individuals. I'll just be briefly talking about the death notification part. In previous years, once someone died, their loved ones would have to go to several departments to ensure that information was updated across government. Under Tell Us Once, though, they only need to file once with a Tell Us Once officer, and the government internally takes care of the information sharing. So the way that this developed was in partnership with several central and local bodies. As of today, I think about 96% of UK councils have opted in. And the features of the program have been a single cross-central and local governance model, funding in accordance with contributions, and completely opt-in, limited to, again, a very tightly defined use case. And the benefits between 2011 and 2021 have been estimated to be about £255 million, a third of which have accrued to individuals and about 2/3 of which have accrued to governments. So these numbers don't include second order benefits, and again are for a very tightly defined use case, but they already give a sense of the kind of savings that once only can create. But that is, again, the program approach. And zooming out for a second, as we talk about OOP as a gateway for government as a platform services, I think the approach that we personally have been very interested in is really the principal approach. But when we talk about the principal approach, it's not, everything is not all easy. It is a harder thing to approach, and it does require certain baseline conditions be met before their implementation. So 3 particular baseline conditions that we identified based on other work that has been done in countries on issues such as digital ID, etc. We kind of iterated these 3 rules from there, and we came up with these 3. So it was rule of law, basically the idea that enforcement of laws should not depend on the relative power of affected parties, because OOP can create greater concentrations that could be risky. We do not want to implement OOP in situations where there is a high risk of new power asymmetries, where power is going to be even more deeply concentrated in the hands of relatively few. And then we don't want OOP to be implemented as a principle where there is weak counterpower of civil society, meaning that they lack a strong or digitally literate civil society, which won't be able to raise issues and push the government. And from here, I think it's time to move on to the kind of stack that we do envision. So the reason we created this stack and started with privacy is because, again, keeping privacy in mind and keeping that principled approach in mind, we're trying to figure out where are areas that we can optimize. So layer one of this is the privacy framework. Privacy is an interesting topic because there's always a question of like, what does it mean? And for us, privacy is about, we've taken the Warren and Brandeis 1890 definition, where people have the right to be let alone and the right to disclose information about themselves on their own terms. To us, there are two particular aspects of privacy that need to be addressed. So that is data privacy, meaning who has authorized access to personal data and how can they use this data from a legal standpoint. And then two is data protection, meaning how is data secured from a technological standpoint. Ultimately, robustly determined and enforced standards covering both data privacy and data protection will determine the foundational rules and rails for the broader environment within which OOP operates and establish needed limits on the use of personal data by the government. So before you even get to creating a privacy framework, we think there are three things. There are two things that countries should do. One is identify standards that need to be implemented throughout the framework. And ones that came up for us again and again were meaningful consent, increased transparency around data use and storage. Number three was ensuring trust in data use both today and in the future, because one of the things about data is that it is really creating, a permanent record. And then number four was disclosing risks. So these were kind of the standards that we thought are important to integrate. And the second thing that we think countries should do before they even get to the privacy framework is conduct a privacy threat assessment. So this is a new model that we developed, a new tool that we developed, which is about assessing from the big to the small, what are the threats that your country faces. And I think there's some that instinctively countries think of and protect against, and those would be things like, if you have data, how do you protect it from attacks from other countries? But there are smaller threats which still have huge impacts, and those would be things like a government official illegally accessing a record. And so how do you protect against that? And that all then flows into a privacy framework, which we believe has three prongs. One is, of course, having the baseline regulations. Two is, having privacy by design principles. And then three is having robust enforcement. And we believe that all three of these need to be in place. And a privacy framework which works optimally should protect privacy, all the while maintaining usability, retaining the right to act in the public's interest for the government. I think specifically of things like COVID when I say that. And then working within the limited resources that they have. So that's kind of your core layer. And then the second layer for us is the identification mechanism. This is really important because since users only give their information to the government once when necessary under OOP, government departments need some way to request and receive the right user's information. And to successfully do this, they must establish a way to identify individuals, not just within one system, but across multiple government systems, maybe even multiple layers of government systems. This requires deduplication of siloed identifiers. Whatever the mechanism is, it needs to work both in person and online, and it should be able to be used across all relevant government departments. And this is what forms the technical basis for an enabling ecosystem that allows for advanced data sharing in government. And so the thing that we looked at when looking at this mechanism was really the topic of unique identifiers, which are numeric or alphanumeric strings guaranteed to be associated with only one entity. So we specifically looked at, the two main type of unique identifiers. We looked at foundational and functional identifiers. So foundational identifiers are multi-purpose and are used across all of government. They tend to increase the scale, speed, and scope by which government can view the identities of multiple individuals. And there are also high risks that come with it. There's high shared fate risk in that if one piece of information becomes exposed, there's a high risk that all your information could be exposed. There's a high risk of overuse. I am from Pakistan. We have a national identifier and it's linked to literally everything. And then finally, there are many unknown risks with foundational identifier in terms of what kind of scope creep can come in over time. And those are foundational identifiers. The other group, which are functional identifiers, tend to be, they're sector specific. They cover only a limited population and tend to be leveraged only by a specific department or very, maybe one or two specific departments. They tend to be much harder to scale than foundational identifiers. They tend to be less inclusive in terms of the population coverage, and they're not automatically interoperable like foundational identifiers are. But having said this, we noticed two approaches, which used one using foundational and one using functional identifiers that came out, and each of these dealt with the privacy concerns and risks in different ways. So, why don't we start off with the experience of Australia? In Australia, once only is a central part of the government's digital transformation strategy, which sets a countrywide direction until the end of 2025. Um, for the Australian government, once only is really a part of the whole of government platform service, and it fits into the government's vision of building government services that are easy to deal with, informed by the citizen, and fit for the digital age, while simultaneously also delivering on issues of privacy. I spoke to some people from the government who worked on this, and for them, they spoke about how the pilot stage of once only in Australia was really limited to fully examining a single scenario, which was giving users the ability to advise the government of a change in circumstance or personal information once. An example of this might be informing both the tax system and the traffic authority of a change of address at the same time. And while they were doing this, what they realized that what was missing was a unique identifier. So, what currently exists in Australia is an identity system that is federated by design. They have many different types of ID, and they have instituted something called a 100-point check, which is a point system for different types of identification. So, if identification is required, you need to figure out how to add up different types of ID, be it a birth certificate or a passport or driver's license, so that it adds up to 100 points, and then that will be used as your, identification in the system. They are now transforming this into something called MyGov ID or digital ID, which is the 100-point check in single form. It only requires the base documents that you put in the 100 check to be verified once, and most importantly, it links to a unique identifier. And so this becomes a new foundational unique identifier that people who are in the system can use. But to protect against some of the privacy concerns, they've created a tokenized system. Under tokenization, when shared, the sensitive unique identifier is substituted with a non-sensitive unique token that has no exploitable meaning or value, and thus means that the individual cannot be tracked. So that's the Australian experience of how they've dealt with this layer for once only in particular. And the Canadians have come up with a very different approach. So in Canada, in 2019-2020, the Treasury Board Secretariat piloted an OOP solution. They wanted to experiment with interoperability and solutions that actually work to build out a robust digital ecosystem. While functional identifiers, in my opinion, are more suited to programmatic OOP approaches, there is some nascent evidence they can be leveraged for the principle of approach if a sufficiently strong identity stitching mechanism is in place. An identity stitching mechanism means something that allows an individual's records across different departments to be cross-checked and ratified. And that kind of is what the Canadians went with. From the pilot, TBS ascertained that an API-based identity management system that stitches and maps client across different services, all of which use their own functional unique identification systems in the back end, is technically feasible. So under the system, mapping is not automatically initiated. A client is mapped only when a user initiates an interaction with a once-only service, and the client's full identity profile is known only to the system, is not stored anywhere, can be accessed by a government official. Thus, the anonymity of the client is theoretically well maintained. While this is a very exciting new approach, at this point, it is unclear how it would be scaled up and what new limitations might come up as as you try to scale something like this. Okay, so that leads to our third layer, which is the data sharing mechanism. This is the third layer in the OOP stack. just kind of going back to that, since I know we've been using a lot of numbers. Um, for a data sharing mechanism, there are really two key components. One is data classification, and one is data exchange. And neither of these components can be developed in an ad hoc manner. From the onset, either they should already have, or in the future, should be created with the idea that in the future they will have the ability to have the ability to be implemented across all of government with common standards, practices, and rules/agreements. So, data classification is the first one that we're dealing with. This includes the idea of data structure, a set of standards to ensure that data is semantically uniform and thus understandable and usable across all departments and ministries, and data sensitivity, or a common set of rules across government departments that materially impact data access. The example that we really liked in term that deals with both structure and sensitivity are registries. So we focused quite a bit of time on looking at registries. Registries are trusted and authoritative sources of information under the control of a public administration or organization. Registries are distinguished from other data repositories like databases, reports, and lists because they are the only authoritative list of a specific type of thing. And they can be formed around data on persons, vehicle licenses, buildings, all sorts of things. Registries expose data held within through APIs to agreed upon open standards and have appropriate governance and ownership in place. And separately or in combination with other registries, they form the cornerstone of public services and can be an enabler for once only. The great thing about registries is that they provide quality data, which is updated upon which other services can be built. They provide that standardized way of defining, accessing, and using needed information. And over time, departments that aim to leverage the benefits of data sharing would be well suited to moving from databases to things like registries. The requirements, though, for registry is that it really needs a clear governance model and a clear process for establishing a new registry, which is what we have seen in the UK. And we can get further into that into the Q&A if there's any interest. So moving from data classification, we'll just touch upon data exchange, which is a system of standard agreements and technical infrastructure across departments that make data exchange between government and even possibly non-government actors possible. The data exchange is the system that allows government departments to build a pipeline of data collaboration projects with other departments across various layers of government. And so there are three basic models that we've seen in data exchange. It can be distributed, it can be centralized, or it can be federated. And distributed is kind of the ad hoc model where everyone has their own version of data, and it's okay for a program approach, but it doesn't necessarily work for a once only principal once only approach. The other model is a centralized model. This is where there's a single data authority, a single data repository. There's no need for standardization because everything exists in the same space. But the risk of this is that it's a hugely high security and high privacy risks because there's a single honeypot of data that is being created. And so you need to create sufficient protections around that as well. We have not seen this being used anywhere yet. And I can't imagine that would be the direction in which it would make sense to go. And so then the real model that we think would work for a principal approach, once only model, would be the federated approach, where a canonical data source is designated. So the canonical data source, for example, could be a registry in this case. And then the data is largely held only once. All sources are independent but linked. And then there is a central crossroads infrastructure that is added so that data can move easily between different layers and different departments. So just briefly talking about examples that we've seen in data sharing in both the Netherlands and Estonia. The Netherlands has a system of base registries, or basis registrati, which, forgive my pronunciation, which sit at the heart of the country's data sharing infrastructure. There are 10 core registries, each describing a specific domain, and each registry has a primary source holder. The source holders collect the data, check it, and make it available to the registry. And all government agencies must connect to the base registries to make use of the data. one of the 10 registries in particular, which is the BRP, or the Personal Records Database, tracks the personal data of all Netherlands residents, which includes their name, date, place of birth, address, and familial relationships. And it is by far the most leverage of the 10 base registries that the Netherlands has. The registries were created as part of the 1998 Electronic Government Action Program. And each registry is governed by specific laws that lay out the conditions and limitations of its use. And there's also a single government catalog, in addition to the registries, which shows what data is held where, what the data means, and how the system is interconnected. So that's an example from the Netherlands. In Estonia, quite famously, in terms of data sharing, they in 2001 introduced the X-Road, which forms the backbone of the Estonian digital government. It ensures secure and direct internet-based data exchange by creating an enabling technological and organizational environment within which members can interact. Through the X-Road, both public and private sector organizations can join the system. It allows members to obtain master data from canonical data sources. And while originally it was just used to query different data sources, it now has the ability to write to multiple databases, transmit large data sets, and perform searches across several databases. And to help with the security and privacy of the system, each X-Road member has its own secure server, an adapter or translator that sends and receives information in the X-Road format so that the schematic structure, remains the same. And just by one estimate, I believe, the X-Road, they say, has saved the Estonian government 844 years of working time, which is quite significant. Okay, so that kind of, went through the whole stack, but now we come to the actual policy implementation, and that kind of is, I guess, the last on the layers of this stack. And when we were looking at how OOP has developed across countries, we kind of came up with a basic implementation roadmap, which would work both for a programmatic approach and for a principled approach, but really is geared again towards that principled approach. The OOP implementation roadmap is basically like taking, both a short-term and a long-term view. So in the short term, it's about laying the foundation for OOP. And this, we've kind of picked up on three things in particular. Creating a good governance model. The European experience shows that a central governance model which directs the activity for once only in the long run has been quite effective for them. This is the body that will help direct how action takes place. We've also seen that choosing the right use case is really important. And so there are different ways that countries can do this. You can either pick up like low-hanging fruit, which seem like easy to execute and prove quickly. Alternatively, one could demonstrate success with willing ministries, which is kind of more of the approach that Canada seems to have taken. Or alternatively, you could assess which issues represent the biggest pain points for citizens and try to tackle those, which is the approach that the UK took. And then the last piece of laying the foundation is determining the service design. And for this, there's several things that can be said here, but the ones that we noticed was, one, figuring out how enrollment works. So do you want to create an OOP system which is opt-in, or do you want to create an OOP system which is opt-out? Now, the opt-in, especially for situations, for contexts where there is low trust in government, I think is very important in helping build that trust, and is just more preferred from a privacy standpoint. Another issue that we see here is an issue of consent. The question is, should you be providing blanket? Should an individual providing consent for an OOP system, should that mean that it's blanket consent for all OOP infrastructure, or is it specific to only a specific program? Again, specific consent is more privacy protecting, but can also create certain difficulties in the system design, and that should be taken into account. And finally, third, the last piece of service design that is interesting and important to keep in mind is functions. What functions do you want to build into the system? So for this, the things that we picked up on that we really liked from other contexts was, creating platforms for personal access and control of your data. So for example, in Estonia, they have something called the My Data Portal. You go online, you log in, and you can see all the data the government has on you, and you can see when it was accessed. And the other thing that we really liked was the idea of creating tamper-proof logs. And so these functionalities, we think, could really enhance, the value of OOP to the citizen, and is particularly from a privacy point of view. So once the foundation is set, you need to then plan for scale. And in plan for scale, there are really two things that came up. One was streamlining. And by this, we mean, adapting the UX, adapting the system, updating the technology. And it really is about continuing to optimize the system depending on what learnings you have at every stage. So OOP is not the type of thing that you can just put in place and kind of move from. It is something that needs to be regularly kind of monitored and worked on constantly. And the second thing about ensuring feasibility at scale is really important, because this is about, do you have the right IT infrastructure in place? Do you have the right personnel in place? And do we have the right business case in place that can help? And then there are several policy areas that we must work across, legal, governance, technical feasibility, trust, and then political implementer buy-in that need to be thought about across all these stages. And the buy-in is particularly important, because the more we talk to people, the more it became clear that implementer buy-in and long-term political buy-in, like these are the two things that can make or break the system. So for my final example over here, I'm just going to talk quickly about the Netherlands, who had two outstanding, they've been a mature country, but two outstanding questions that are constantly being debated in the public sphere over there are whether privacy is being adequately maintained, A, and B, what level of data visibility citizens should be granted. So on the question of, is privacy being adequately maintained? There was a case a little while ago of the Dutch tax agency accessing and tracking data about citizens using commercially leased cars to make tax rulings. And this became extremely controversial, and a standing policy now recognizes it as an unaccepted usage of data. Another issue that we see in this arena of maintaining privacy is that departments now seem to be creating copies or shadow registries from the primary system. And this is something that needs to be controlled, because it degrades the quality of data that is coming in, because it's not being constantly updated, but also because it could be used in ways that are not optimal for the citizen. But this is a result of the technology being old, and so departments have kind of moved to that. And on the issue of data visibility, the Netherlands have also given individuals visibility into what's happening over their own data. But the degree to which this is feasible in practice is questionable, because there's so many queries that happens. And so the Netherlands, to kind of deal with this, have kind of moved to a paper system where someone can request their record from the year. But if everyone was to make a paper request, the system would likely collapse. So there are still continuing issues over there. And yeah, that kind of brings me to the end of this chat, and I'm going to hand it over to Amanda.